In 1945, James Hampton was honorably discharged from the Air Force with a Bronze Star. Since he was a black man, he had served in a segregated unit stationed in Guam. During his time there, he was a carpenter and maintained aircraft, and for some reason he built a small shrine-like object in his spare time. Following the war, he worked as a janitor, and until the end of his life, he collected odds and ends, bits and pieces of material of all kinds. He started to build a series of objects in his garage until his death in 1964. He kept diaries as he worked, which mention extensive sections of the Bible regarding revelations and the world to come, and it is likely that Hampton had an intense religious inner life that was driving him, although in his day-to-day he was just a soft-spoken janitor who went largely unnoticed. Over 180 objects were discovered after his death, which all surround a massive golden throne. As a whole, the work is called The Throne of the Third Heaven. No one knows why he made it, or even quite how he did it. While he was alive, no one is known to have seen it, and from what has been pieced together about his life from his private notes, he was frequently visited by intense religious dreams, which inspired him to create this vast, unearthly piece, apparently for no one. You can see it right now in the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C. Inscribed on the giant throne are the words, "Fear not." This is Haute-Rive in southern France. It's a nice little town. In 1879, the local postman Ferdinand Cheval was walking along his usual route, just as he had done for many years. However, on this one day, his foot caught on something, a small stone. He later reported that he had been experiencing unusual dreams about a grand palace, which he had told no one about for fear of ridicule. Looking down, he picked up the stone and put it in his pocket. He would find another the next day and the next. Sometimes a single stone, sometimes many. It's unclear how he chose them, but these were special stones. Over the next 33 years, he used these special stones to build his palace. Today, Le Palais Edier boasts a frontage 85 feet long and 33 feet high. It is a gigantic structure, built in line with the dreaming whims of a French postman working completely alone with his bare hands, a knack for picking up stones, and a good deal of cement. The sculpted walls bear reliefs of different styles, an entire Egyptian-style temple, and two waterfalls called the Source of Life and the Source of Wisdom. Cheval wanted to be buried in his palace eventually, and built himself a mausoleum section, naturally. He had no particular urge to show off his work, but when the likes of Pablo Picasso made the trip just to praise him, it became clear how significant the ideal palace had become. In 1969, Cheval appeared on a French postage stamp in recognition of his dream. Why build the throne of the third heaven? Why build the ideal palace? Why do dreams come to us with strange images and unearthly urges that demand to be made whole in the waking world? I don't know. Maybe these strange dreamers just had a love of craft. In 1620, a group of pilgrims established the Plymouth colony, a new settlement in the New World, the second permanent settlement of Europeans, that we properly know about anyway. And the settlement grew, and the colony grew, and in time came to be known as New England. Think of that for a moment. These people had a dream of recreating England on the other side of the world, of imposing their values and ideals on a part of the world that had no particular place for them, and they intended to do it with little more than basic carpentry, farming techniques that were vaguely remembered at best, and shoes with buckles on them. Now that's a mad dream for you. Maybe that thread of madness, maybe it became woven into the fabric of this place. Maybe it's all a little bit mad. Maybe it seeped into the soil and the water and became a part of it. All just as much as timber-framed houses, quaint lighthouses, and shoes with buckles on them. Does that idea send a shiver down your spine? Do you look at the wild coastline of New England again and see the madness dripping over every stone? Do you see it in the morning dew just behind the leaves? Do you hear it in the screaming of the cats when the moon is high? Does it really sound so far-fetched? If there ever was such a thing as madness here, it has deep roots and high flowers. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born right here in Providence, Rhode Island, in 1890. For the larger part of his life, he really wasn't much of anything. A strange little man who never quite fit in anywhere, which is strange in itself. His mother, Sarah Susan Phillips, could trace her ancestry back to one of those pilgrims, Mr. George Phillips, who arrived back in 1630 in the buckles-on-shoes days. Young H.P. Lovecraft should have felt right at home, rooted to the ground by legacy. But you remember what else has deep roots here. H.P. Lovecraft was a bit of a recluse from an early age. He didn't enjoy the company of men, loathed the company of women, despised the company of children, was repulsed by the company of foreigners, was repelled by the company of other races, and found it hard making friends with anyone who met his ludicrous standards because they all thought he was weird. Even by the standards of the day, he was a strange one. However, an odd child can always be brought out of his shell by a loving and supportive family. H.P. Lovecraft's father, a traveling salesman, suffered some kind of neurological breakdown in a Chicago hotel room for no apparent reason, and spent the next 5 years semi-paralyzed before dying when Lovecraft was 8. It is likely that the man had an advanced form of syphilis. The rearing and development of young H.P. was turned over to his nearest remaining family. In turn, these were an overbearing mother who would go on to develop a tumultuous relationship with him based on extreme fondness balanced with intense hatred. He also had 2 aunts who are mentioned little in his diaries except for that they interfered in his love life and terrified him by walking around in black gowns all the time when there was a family tragedy, and inspiring a lifelong fear of what he called night gaunts. For a time, he was doted upon by his grandfather, the industrialist Whipple Van Buren Phillips. Yes, that was his name. The old man apparently loved the boy, and for some reason delighted in telling him gothic tales of dread that he would make up on the fly. Sadly, the charming old man passed away when Lovecraft was 14, throwing the family into abject penury and provoking night-gaunt aunties to parade around like harbingers of dread, and young H.P. to first begin contemplating hurling himself into the nearest river. Basically, the life of young H.P. Lovecraft was so intensely bizarre, introverted, and regularly filled with weirdness and horror that, let's just say, he didn't come out of his shell. If anything, he developed a series of additional shells, each more spiky and foreboding than the last. You might call him a Russian doll of neuroses and fear, except I'm pretty sure he couldn't stand the Russians either. Lovecraft became a young man who would have been content staying indoors and shutting out the world forever, except that he had one urge that he couldn't seem to shake. Lovecraft couldn't stop writing, and I mean writing anything. He loved to read, too, even though a series of nervous breakdowns meant that he never completed formal education, a fact which was naturally a source of constant shame and more thoughts about jumping in the river. He would write short articles constantly for local news and periodicals, and when he wasn't reading or composing articles, he would write letters. Most people in the early 20th century used letters as a standard form of communication. You had something you wanted to get off your chest or mention to a friend, you'd zip off a short letter. H.P. Lovecraft was not like most people. He had developed a love of cheap pulp magazines that would publish various short stories regularly, and he found himself disliking the work of one author in the Argosy magazine called Fred Jackson. It seems that Jackson would write romantic tales that Lovecraft found insipid and dull, and instead of dashing off a quick comment or two and calling it a day, he wrote an enormous screed against Jackson in verse, and the magazine was so impressed they published it. In fact, they kept publishing Lovecraft's long and unhinged letters, debating the various merits of Jackson with irritated fans of sappy romance, usually in intense heroic rhyme. This insane letter-writing crusade eventually reached the point of impressing a group of writers forming their own magazine who invited Lovecraft to contribute. H.P. Lovecraft had spent his young life like a hermit, reading voraciously, tormented by dreams of the Gothic and his bizarre family, and now his relentless urge to write found a real outlet. There was no going back. He would pen weird tales, weird with a capital W, in a style that was once original and yet at the same time harkened back to an imagined past of cyclopean structures and titanic cosmic horrors who would writhe and join and part in the stars above, utterly indifferent to our lives and casually lethal to any who dare seek out knowledge of higher places where man was not intended to tread. Incidentally, cyclopean architecture just means very, very big. It means gigantic in this context, because the original Cyclops was a giant. Fun fact for you all. As he began to acquire a following, he gained the notice of other authors who liked to traffic in the weird, and would finally create what is now known as the Cthulhu Mythos, a loosely connected cycle of legends which together form a connected fictional universe, often linked by references to a mythical book called the Necronomicon. He was content to let other authors play in his dark garden, and the literary voices of the weird would often trade letters and stories with Lovecraft, swapping and embellishing details of the mythos as they did. This is how Robert Howard, the similarly bizarre creator of Conan the Barbarian, came to know Lovecraft through letter correspondence, and the two men would challenge and improve each other. New England in the 1920s was hardly a metropolitan hotbed of progressive thought, but even by the standards of the day, Lovecraft was particularly racist. There isn't an excuse for that. Lovecraft would almost certainly have been diagnosed with any number of psychological issues today, but while his problems may have exacerbated his personal issues, they did not cause them. The man was racist in a way that is fundamentally repellent, and almost made a point of being as racist as possible at times. This is worth mentioning, because in 1921 he met the love of his life, Sonia Haft-Green, a Russian Jew from New York. Weirdly, by the standards of H.P. Lovecraft, he moved to New York to move in with her, and married her, against the wishes of his terrifying Gothic nightmare aunts. Does this mean that H.P. deserves a reassessment? After all, he is known to have had cordial relations with at least some of the Jewish community, and seems to have been capable of at least trying to leave his comfort zone. No. The writing is good, for the most part, but the man was definitely a messed up racist, and there's not really any getting away from that. Needless to say, things did not go well for Lovecraft, as he was apparently a lightning rod for devastating bad luck. He had great difficulty finding work in New York, and when Sonia managed to find work over in Cleveland, he had to take a smaller apartment of his own and live in the Red Hook district among a high immigrant population. This did not improve Lovecraft's disposition. He eventually decided to move back to Providence, but the aunts struck again and refused to allow his wife to move back with him, since being married to a simple tradeswoman would be yet another shame for the family to bear. He may have loved her as much as Lovecraft loved anyone, but they divorced, as the odds demanded. Lovecraft spent the last 10 years or so of his life churning out material, and some of his best, according to fans. But of course, he could never be far from tragedy. He became ill with what turned out to be intestinal cancer, and died at the age of 47. He never published a full book. He never really held down a proper job of any substance, and if it weren't for the fact that he had a habit of excoriating an author who just wanted to make people happy with romantic literature, he would never have been noticed at all. It's not to say that Lovecraft didn't wish for greater recognition, but it is likely that he would have written all of those stories even if no one had ever read them. Perhaps they would have remained unpublished papers in the collection of a strange New England recluse, discovered only after he passed, if at all. During his lifetime, Lovecraft was certainly an outsider artist, someone who kept himself aloof and separate from a world which didn't understand him, and he didn't want too much of a part in. He had his books, and his writing, and his dreams of cosmic horror in the infinite spheres of deep space, and that was always enough to keep him going. Some people are just compelled to do things for reasons they and we cannot entirely explain, try as we might. Anyone can take up a course because they want to. Anyone can develop a craft and hone it like an edge. But now and then we find people among us who simply must do what they are doing. You can't stop them, you certainly can't explain them, and when they pass in and out of this world, they will often leave things behind them. Grand palaces, or golden thrones, or a vision laid down in words. We pick through these items, and we can appreciate them and feel wonder, but we can't explain them. These objects are the trail left by people who are only half in this world, or perhaps they are just visiting. What they leave behind them grants a vision, for a moment, into another world we could never visit. Perhaps it's better that way. If we knew too much about the third heaven, or the meaning of the source of life and the source of wisdom, we might be more knowledgeable people, but we wouldn't be better ones. Some things really are outside the knowledge of mankind. We can only pick up the remnants of travelers and wonder what's really out there. H.P. Lovecraft knew, or he thought he did, or he dreamed he did, and he lived a life of tragedy, misery, and creeping madness. We don't need to forgive him for his often terrible outlook, but nor can we forget to pity him either. This has been another Profile in Cinemania. This episode was written and performed by Andy Slack, sound design and editing also by Andy Slack. Incidental music and sound effects courtesy of Epidemic Sound.